The shipping container, this really does feel like moving from the very sublime and interesting to the quite ridiculous. So let me tell you why I'm interested in shipping containers. One of the things that I suppose this social world in 100 objects theme to me seems to be pursuing is the idea that by taking a particular object, we can kind of unfold the world that makes it possible, yeah? Whether it's mirrors or breasts or suits or whatever, that we can kind of begin with something and then disentangle the social relations which make this object, which make it possible, which make it mundane, in a sense. Because what could be more mundane than a shipping container? I, for quite a while now, have been chasing sort of everyday objects and trying to make them magical. And this sort of rusty tin box that you see at ports or on articulated lorries and so on, I've been trying to enchant it. I've been trying to make it mysterious, to make it into a treasure chest of some kind. And so I've been doing some work on the history of the shipping container, but also on the malleability, the flexibility of the container. Because it's not just a shipping container, it becomes a piece of the social world that gets used in lots of different ways and contains a whole range of different kind of possibilities and threats, depending on how you tell the story. So, I'm going to now catapult you through a series of things fairly quickly. The shipping container is a relatively recent invention, okay? About 1960, something like that. Up until that point, most of global trade happened on ships in terms of what was usually called break bulk. That's to say, enormous quantities of little bits and pieces. So this ship, the SS Warrior, 1954, 194,582 separate things, all different shapes and sizes, requiring an enormous amount of labour, dockers with hooks and stuff like that, big ports and lots of things, in order just to move all this stuff around, okay? Then, from about the 1960s onwards, containerization starts to happen. This is the world it brings about. It's a world which is, in a sense, stereotypically modern in its sense of standardization, in senses of movement, and in terms of the kind of promise, the plenty that it appears to offer us, with huge quantities of stuff moving around in these rusty magic boxes. The shipping container parks themselves always strike me as rather magical places, you know, almost kind of mirroring the cities beyond, but also like a kind of tessellation of rather magical Lego bricks, and you never know what's in them. You never know what possibilities they might unfold. Of course, it's also a story of the reconfiguring of the social and the urban in a whole variety of ways, which are painfully obvious to anybody who lived in a port city. So the move from break bulk to containers effectively meant a move from dockers to cranes. It meant that large numbers of people, say in ports like Liverpool and Southampton and so on, were effectively chucked out of work because they were no longer needed. Because the shipping container could move stuff much more effectively. But there don't seem to be any people there. It's just a series of machines, okay? The people who inhabited the old ports, if you look at pictures of old ports, it's full of noise and alcohol and stealing and shouting and the rest of it, replaced with this sort of translucent peace and quiet with only the whine of steel gantries and maybe a couple of people in the tops of these cranes or in the various transporters that are moving the boxes around. Again, sorry. What you also get is a reconfiguration of the urban, because of course a lot of the container parks, the container ports moved to different places because they needed different kind of harbours and different kind of harbour front. So effectively the urban that produced ports like New York and London and Liverpool and so on was reconfigured to be replaced by new kinds of container ports like, for example, Rotterdam and Shanghai and so on, which were different in their configuration, very often much more privatised spaces surrounded by huge steel fences rather than places where the urban was part of the fabric. And this is predicated, of course, simply on a single act of standardization, the TU, the 20-foot equivalent unit, which is 8 by 8 by 40. Yeah? So the story goes, and this is a story that's often enough told in terms of business and management texts now, is the container one of the technologies that brings about globalization. in a fairly uncomplicated kind of way. This sort of standardization allows for the movement of things in ways that were previously unimaginable, and then becomes, in various accounts, a kind of precondition for, say, for example, the rise of Far East manufacturing, most particularly China, with all this stuff being moved around the globe. And of course, increasingly, stories about things like, chickens being slaughtered in Scotland and then taken to China because it's easier to fillet them there and then bring them back again to be sold in British supermarkets. There are these strange paradoxes, largely based on the idea that it's now fantastically cheap, almost frictionless, seemingly, to move things around the world. Okay. But this story, for me, is far too simple. It's a bit like what I'm calling here a tessellation. Tessellation is a figure where everything fits together too neatly, yeah? Because what we have is a story about the world getting better because of the invention of some form of standardization, okay? So there's some poor dockers, but they were inefficient anyway, da-da-da-da-da. But it's a kind of story of a simple story of technological progress and advancement that leads to economic benefits. It's something along those lines. But once you actually start to look at what shipping containers are used for and what they are, the story gets a lot more complicated, and the containers themselves, I think, get a lot more magical. So I'm kind of trying to uncontain the containers, in a sense, or the story about containers. So one of the stories is a story about efficiency. But in practice, once you start to realize about the flows of global trade, it's more like a kind of a strange driftwood almost, because what you can see is these huge numbers of empty containers that are now being shipped around the world simply because of inequalities in global trade. So you can imagine the ships that are coming from China are pretty much full of stuff that we can stuff our supermarkets and DIY shops with and buy Christmas tat to sell in stockings and all the rest of it, but the ones going back are very often empty. And for a long time, when steel was relatively cheap, these things weren't even bothering to ship them back. So container ports like Oakland, for example, were basically piling up with huge drifts of containers that nobody really wanted. Now, in many parts of the world, this caused some quite curious incidents, really, because effectively somebody had to use the containers for something. They needed to get rid of them. And it's in part that then develops a whole series of alternative uses for containers. So containers which, this is a very dense slide, but just pick at it. Containers used as art galleries, containers used as housing after various kinds of crises, containers routinely used by the military to transport stuff around, containers which are used as in art projects and so on. This enormous variety of things that the shipping container actually ended up getting used for. So the standardization story is kind of counterposed by this rather marvelous sort of magical flowering of alternative uses for containers. This one's, I think, it's a surf shop, and again, this one, some other kind of, I think this might be a military one by the looks of it, with a flag. And this is the sort of container city sort of developments. You might have seen lots of this stuff on telly. Quite often when they do those sort of build your own house programs, there'll be a shipping container version of this. The advantage of the shipping container, of course, is that it can be effectively treated as modular. As long as you don't cut through any of the main struts, then you can do pretty much anything with it, including stacking it and using it for a whole variety of things. The shipping container has been central to a story about the military too. One of the accounts that is usually not told about the dissemination of the shipping container, and most particularly why the shipping container is an imperial rather than metric, is because of Vietnam. Because of the resupply problems that the American military had in terms of making sure that this huge army had enough hamburgers and Coca-Cola and guns. Yeah? So effectively, the standardization is predicated on an imperial metric, quite literally, rather than metric, yeah, which we expect to be the most common form of standardization, since that's the one that the rest of the world generally uses. We also have these kind of curious scares about shipping containers. So the shipping container, as well as being a kind of a sort of a cipher for economic progress, is also a source of a great deal of fear. The states themselves, the 13 dead girls in a can thing comes from the second series of The Wire, which centers around 13 prostitutes coming into Baltimore Harbor and suffocating. There's plenty and plenty of examples of a variety of different forms of organized crime using shipping containers to move individuals, whether they're sex workers or migrants of various kinds, huge quantities of counterfeit goods or drugs, or indeed weapons. There is a company, and you can look at this astonishing thing on on YouTube, if you like, that's selling basically a missile in a box, right? So the idea is, it's called the Club K, so you can get a shipping container and it's got a cruise missile inside it or something like that, so you can easily move it around. Yeah? It's sold for defence purposes only, if that makes it better. And again, in any case, in terms of security, as any of you who've been paying attention to the news will notice, the vast majority of shipping containers are entirely opaque. They don't get looked at. The bill that says what's in them is usually wrong on many, many cases. And how else do you think all the drugs move around, and all the guns and all the rest of it? They move around in shipping containers which are locked and sealed, and are very, very difficult to effectively survey in any meaningful way. So the story of the kind of, if you like, the boundless transparency of global trade is also offset by this idea of something that the American government were particularly worried about. What if somebody puts a nuclear bomb in a shipping container, yeah, and destroys New York? Yeah. The standardization story doesn't even work. Next time you see a shipping container park or a shipping container train, notice that all the containers aren't even the same. It's really bizarre. There are actually, even though the footprints are very often the same, they've got different widths and different heights, and then a whole series of different kinds of containers for different things. Because not all containers can actually do the job that they're supposed to do, because you get oversized things or undersized things and all the rest of it, but also have things like garment-tainers, which carry lots of clothing in, which is hung up and all the rest of it, or chemical containers, or blah, 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 blah. Yeah? So the whole shipping container story about standardization isn't even empirically a very accurate one. And again, this effectively is a kind of a quick account of lots of the different kinds of containers. And indeed, one of the things that we appear to be seeing now is attempts to re-standardize the container away from its imperial metric and towards a metric. And so what we're starting to see is kind of local attempts, if you like, to cede away from the standardization of containers story. And then you get these beautiful examples of container art. Because containers have been employed by artists both as homes for the stuff they want to do, but also as object in themselves. There is, I've forgotten the name of the port now, but there's a container art festival where the idea is you do something interesting with a shipping container, something beautiful and bizarre like that, or this, look at that, isn't that lovely? A lovely, joyful, spotty shipping container. Gorgeous thing. Or darker forms of art. One of the things that spun me off on this was Miroslav Balka doing his piece in the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern, which is seen on this next one. That, you walked into that darkness, that fear, that emptiness. And all you would see, like Plato's cave almost, all you would see is kind of the shadows, yeah, moving in front. So the container is multiple. It's used in lots of different ways. And there's a kind of bizarre sense for me in which that sort of echoes the plenty that it appears to promise. So the easy story about shipping containers and all the fab stuff we get in the containers from China and stuff can then almost be counterposed with this multiplicity of fear and danger, but also a certain kind of emptiness. Yeah? The shipping container as a space. Literally just a space that we stick stuff in, or perhaps a box that we insert meanings into. That'll do. Thank you. I won't do the rest.